What I mean by unjourneying is that when people start to work with these medicines, for the most part, there is a certain kind of journeying that seems to be very, very common. And I just mean by that these experiences of going elsewhere, and maybe even what you shared is a kind of part of it is a kind of journey, like going to a childhood memory. Sometimes you have these very dramatic journeys of going into unity consciousness and whatnot. At least for me, and this isn't everyone's path, and I don't mean to imply that there's only one way to do this because there are so many, but I feel like with continued psychedelic work, it feels like those journeys increasingly feel in a way extraneous somehow, or unnecessary, or sort of like a distraction from just what's happening right now, right here in our senses, in our body, in the room, getting in touch with the dance of sensation as it's unfolding.
Hi everyone, welcome to Psychedelic Conversations. We have Mira Funk in the house today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and it's so great to be connecting finally. And for the context, I would like to say a few sentences of your bio, Mira, and then we'll get started from there.
Sounds good.
Great. So you are a LCSW, a queer non-binary psychotherapist and psychedelic guide specialized in serving 5-MeO-DMT and N-DMT, including analog ayahuasca and salvia divinorum. You studied comparative literature at Howard Psychodynamic Psychotherapy at Smith College School for Social Work and Psychedelic Facilitation at Trek.
Mm-hmm.
This is wonderful. We'll add the rest of your bio in the show notes as we do, and your links and your contacts so our listeners can get in touch if they feel connected. But before we dive into the conversation, please tell us what brings you to this work.
Yeah, I think what brings me to this work, or what brought me to this work initially, was my own suffering. And now my passion more is about helping others with their suffering. Childhood was very painful for me in many ways. I was raised in Texas in this fundamentalist Christian family, and I didn't even realize it at the time, but back then I was a queer kid, just trying to make sense of myself, within the confines of these kind of patriarchal, sexist paradigms. And there was a lot of violence in my household. I grew up in kind of a spare the rod, spoil the child household, so there was a lot of corporal punishment. And I also had a lot of chronic illness as well. And this is something I've been piecing together actually the last few years. It turns out that I have a number of different health conditions. Most notably, there's Lyme disease, along with babesia or babesiosis, which is a co-infection. And then that has led to this, what's called mast cell activation syndrome, which is this kind of chronic inflammatory condition. Putting the pieces together, I think that all began for me at quite a young age. I also had this really significant event when I was 8 years old, where I had a febrile seizure. I came very close to dying, and I was without oxygen for a long time. And the doctors actually thought I was going to have pretty severe brain damage. And somehow I pulled through, but I do think it left a lasting impression, both psychologically and neurocognitively. So putting all these different things together, the Lyme, the babesia, the physical violence, the kind of identity-based oppression that I was experiencing. I just feel like at a certain point in my youth, I just was really miserable, and just felt like I was sort of trapped within my own mind, and just having a really hard time being present and being at ease and being comfortable, and just felt lost in my own mind. And so at some point, I just got really interested in healing, and that started with Buddhism, with meditation. I became very interested in psychotherapy, and there's sort of a long path my life takes. But to make a long story short, I ended up getting interested in social work because at some point I feel like I got to a point in my own journey with meditation, with my own psychotherapy, that I was able to start to serve others. And so when I started doing my psychotherapy work, I was very focused on acceptance and commitment therapy and somatic psychotherapy and mindfulness-based approaches. And at some point I kind of hit a plateau, I feel like, where I was doing that work and doing my own inner work. And I still felt like something was missing. And that was around the time that I had my first mushroom trip, which was actually not that long ago, relatively speaking. It was in 2018. And it was just such a revelation to me. It was a fairly low dose, and it just really crystallized for me a lot of things that I had been interested in, especially within Buddhism, within non-dual spiritual traditions. There was just this very clear realization of everything arising as consciousness, everything being unified, there being no kind of separation between me and not me, or subject and object. It all kind of fell away. And that just was a huge threshold moment for me, a turning point. And I started to experiment with other medicines. And I just became very passionate about this work, working on my own, working with guides in the underground. And I experienced so much healing and so much insight at a spiritual level that I just realized at some point there was no going back in terms of my professional practice, that I would no longer just be a talk therapist, that I had to incorporate psychedelics and do psychedelic psychotherapy. I was working at Oregon State University at the time in their counseling department, and I knew that that environment wasn't going to be conducive to what I wanted to do. So that's when I left to start my private practice, and that was back in 2020. And so, so for the past 4 years, I've been doing this work, and I first just focused on the integration aspect. And then at a certain point in time, I decided to start facilitating as well, and I started training more specifically in facilitation. I started with mushrooms, and then I moved on to 5-MeO-DMT. And then more recently, I've been serving an N-DMT, the analog ayahuasca as well. And then my current obsession is salvia divinorum, which I can say more about. So yeah, that's kind of the whole arc of my story.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate the, fully being here and wanting to share part of your story. I think it's really important because I think our listeners connect really well. It's almost like, we all have these stories that brings us to this work, right? So, and what I wanted to say here is, would you say that having your psychedelic or, psychotherapeutic background or psychotherapy background was helpful in a way? Because you said that when you first had your experience, psychedelic experience with, I think it was the mushrooms, you said it kind of helped crystallize certain aspects. You know what? As you were talking, it reminded me of Dr. James Fadiman's talk. He said in one of his talks, this was quite a talk that he gave a long time ago, actually. He says, for example, the substance in the talk was LSD, but he was saying, don't take LSD to learn about rocket science. Like learn about rocket science first and then take LSD. It reminded me. And I feel like it's almost like, if you have sort of understanding, a foundation, a therapeutic background, or at least conceptually, intellectually understanding or studied, also you studied mindfulness and other practices. Do you think that's a really good way to begin? Because imagine not having any idea of these things and then suddenly being thrown into a psychedelic experience. How would you say that, or that it doesn't matter? It will happen as it needs to happen anyway. Some people always say, whatever needs to happen, or it's not what you want, but what you need type of thing. How do you make connections around these concepts?
I think adequate preparation is absolutely critical for this work, especially for a beginner who's never done these medicines before. And I think the key actually is not the kind of psychoeducation or intellectual preparation, but the experiential somatic preparation. And I can tell you what I do with my clients to answer the question really directly. is the first thing that I do with them after we build the psychotherapeutic kind of rapport and relationship and I get to know them is I start to bring them into the body. So I invite them to feel their discomfort, actually, their psychological distress as a somatic kind of sensation, a somatic energetic arising. And so I have this meditation that I've developed over the years. I like to call it the hot stove meditation. And the premise of it is that if we touch a hot stove, the body and the nervous system is incredibly intelligent. It knows to remove the hand before you even realize. It's an instantaneous reaction. It's brilliant. However, it's misapplied. That same strategy of avoidance is misapplied to our psychological distress. And so as humans, when we have psychological distress, or you could say when we have chronic pain that's not actually an imminent threat, we use that same strategy of reflexive avoidance, but that actually increases the suffering. Because what needs to happen is we need to actually connect in the body with the feeling as sensation, as energy in the body. And so in the meditation, metaphorically, I'm inviting my clients to keep their hand on the hot stove. And when you do that and you stay with the sensations, you realize that it's not actually burning you. The traumatic memory that you have from 10 years ago, if you can experience it as an arising of energy in the body and the nervous system now, it's not actually destroying you. It's not actually life-threatening. But our nervous system has to learn that. And so I would say that is probably the primary skill that I think is essential for psychedelic preparation, is learning how can you allow distress to arise and then notice that pull, that reflexive pull to avoid, because that's what we all do, right? We get on our phones, or we think about it obsessively, or we engage in some habit or something like that. But actually staying with the sensation and finding it in the body. Is it butterflies in the stomach? Is it, an increase in heart rate? Is it tension somewhere in the chest or the face? Is it heat? And then going into that as deeply as possible. And this comes from the Vipassana Buddhist tradition. So this is nothing really new. I'm just recycling old wisdom from generations ago. But how can you find the energy in the body and connect with that as deeply as possible? So that's the first skill that I really teach people. And again, it's not something that it's not like I have to teach them a course, or they have to have a background in psychotherapy or philosophy or anything like that. It's something that actually is quite intuitive. I think of it as much more like learning how to dance or learn how to ride a bike. It's a skill that you get in your nervous system of, oh, okay, when distress arises, I can just be with it. And that is so important because, of course, when you take most psychedelics, especially the tryptamine class of psychedelics, the first thing people usually notice is their heart rate is elevated, right? And they might experience a kind of hyper arousal of the nervous system, or there might be a sudden emergence of distressing content. And, if your mind is prepared for that, and oh, okay, here it is, here's the wave. I can just sit with, I can notice it in the body. That wave will pass through you and it's not going to overwhelm you. The other skill that I really focus on with people is non-duality. And I can just define that briefly, how I understand that term, because it's such a kind of vague term that's often, I think, overused these days. In brief, the way that I explain it to people, and then again, I try to just get into the practice, so it's not a philosophy. I just invite people to imagine, what if you were dreaming right now, and then you woke up in the dream, so you're having a lucid dream. If that happened, you would be able to look around and you would be able to have the sense of, oh, okay, I see my hand, I see the wall or the building or the animal, whatever the different objects are arising in the dream. But you would also have this knowing, this direct perceptual knowing that it's all part of the same dreamscape. It's all made of the same thing, so to speak. You could say it's all made of consciousness. It's all made of dream stuff. And you would be able to know that because it would just be very intuitive. And so for me, non-duality is not only having that happen perhaps in a lucid dream, but more practically having that same awareness arising and cultivated in waking life, recognizing that in a certain way of speaking, this comes from the Tibetan dream yoga tradition. You could say that we're always kind of dreaming in the sense that our mind is constantly creating our reality. And you could talk about that neuroscientifically as well. But there's this way of directly noticing that in your senses. So it's not just an idea, philosophy. And so I have this whole system of teaching people how to notice that visually. So you're really seeing, instead of seeing stuff and objects, you're seeing visual consciousness. Instead of hearing sounds, you're hearing auditory consciousness, and you're touching into consciousness. And so when I teach people that other skill, then when these journeys get deeper, and I think 5-MeO DMT is probably the best medicine to talk about this with, because at the low doses of 5-MeO DMT, usually what's happening is people are having a somatic kind of release. It's very psychological. Trauma in the body is just buzzing and popping and exploding, and it's getting released, almost like getting a deep tissue massage or something like that. And so if people have that physical skill that I talked about, they can just notice that energy and it doesn't overwhelm them. But then as you get deeper into 5-MeO, of course, it starts to get much more ethereal, and you might feel like you're dissolving into everything, or the room is disappearing, or your body is disappearing, and that sort of thing. And so if you've already practiced noticing the nature of everything as consciousness, and noticing how there's inherently no kind of inside or outside, that these are different constructions, and there's a kind of boundlessness to the field of awareness, then when those sensations come online, it doesn't feel overwhelming. It can feel quite familiar, and it allows you just to go deeper into it. So those are kind of the two main skills that I would say I prepare people for. And once they have those under their belt, then I feel like the journeys go pretty smoothly. And I will say, from an ethical standpoint, I will go as far as to say that I think it's essential for people to have these two skills, because if you don't, if you just go in cold and you don't have preparation, maybe I'm a little bit iconoclastic in this way, but I don't buy that maxim that you'll get the trip that you need. I've seen way too many people who have worked with other guides who then come to me for psychological repair work, who are traumatized because the guide has simply given them too high of a dose of medicine with inadequate preparation, inadequate holding and integration on the back end. And they're just really lost, and they're in some kind of depersonalization, derealization, or depression. They're having panic attacks. So I think it's important to remember that these medicines can hurt people. They can hurt people physically. They can hurt people psychologically. And so I think we have to kind of, I hope it's not too extreme to say, treat this almost like surgery on your psyche or on your soul. And so you need a lot of preparation, you need a lot of care around that on the front end and the back end to make sure it goes smoothly.
Thank you so much for sharing. This is very valuable. So would you say, well, to be honest, you can't say it's a surgery. I always say that it's a psychological, almost like psychosomatic, psychological surgery.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
okay.
That's absolutely fine. This is a term that I always use also in my personal, when I'm studying, when I'm talking about it. And it truly is. I think there's a new research that came out very recently that it says, or at least validates, that even taking one time of a psychedelic substance changes you fundamentally, through like from a nervous system or brain proposition. And I think it's correct way of describing. Sometimes people, there's a sort of like a paradox, right? There is people who want to come to do one session, one and done, just want this medicine or substance, heard somewhere that it's heals and repairs and restores really quickly. So there is that. And then once they take the medicine, they don't feel like it's changed them. It didn't help. Somehow they feel like they haven't moved an inch forward. They haven't, and they are really disappointed because of it.
Sure. Yeah.
So how do you talk about, yes, that's true. That's something like, I would say maybe the patterns haven't changed, or patterns haven't sort of disrupted, but at the same time, things have changed internally in the system. Maybe we just need some time to unpack and maybe continue working, because it's never one and done, right? So maybe there needs to be a further commitment to going into the medicine or going into this type of work longer term. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with any medicine, there's always inevitably going to be some kind of bell curve in terms of how people respond. And so I try to be really transparent and clear with people from the very beginning of my relationship with them to manage expectations. Because I think that if you're thinking about that bell curve, you are going to see some people who have incredible, almost miraculous results, And I could name a handful of clients who fall into that category where it is kind of a one and done thing, or so it seems. And I'm following up with them months, years later, and the symptoms they came to me with, the depression, the anxiety, the trauma, seems to have all but disappeared. It's quite remarkable. So that happens. Most people are probably in the middle of that bell curve. They're definitely having some kind of transformation. They're healing some trauma. They're working on their mind-body kind of awareness or present moment connection with themselves, with others. And there's still a lot of work to do. And like you said, maybe they need another session, or maybe, over the years they're doing, multiple kind of journeys or retreats. And then I think every once in a while, at the other end of the spectrum, you do have folks who just don't seem to respond. And why is that? Could it be not the right time? Could it be that they're not ready? Or could it just be that, like any medicine, it's just not going to be effective for whatever reason? Maybe they need to try a different psychedelic. Like sometimes I'm thinking of a client in particular who was working with mushrooms for a while, and he really wanted to have this kind of non-dual breakthrough, to have that kind of unity consciousness experience. Not that that is the be all end all, but it's often this kind of threshold crossing for people with non-duality, where when you experience everything just becoming one, it changes you. Like you said, there is some kind of crossing over, and he couldn't get that with mushrooms, but I really recommended 5-MeO-DMT, and that was exactly the tool he needed. So sometimes it's about switching the approach, switching the medicine, switching the route of administration. In my practice, I serve 5-MeO-DMT both in a vaporized format with vape pens. I also serve it rectally, which I can talk more about. But that often, the rectal route of administration often opens up some really deep healing, especially with pre-verbal childhood trauma that the other route can't quite hit sometimes. So there can be some troubleshooting there. But I also think it's just important to reserve the fact that, like some people just may not respond, and that's okay. And I don't want to invalidate anybody by implying that, it's not working because somehow they haven't done the work or they're not ready. I mean, it could be that psychedelics just aren't for them. I'm sure there are people out there for whom that's true. So yeah, I think there's many ways to look at it.
Yeah, I think so. I think we just need to be open-minded when it comes to the medicines or the substances, or whichever way. I don't know what you call them, medicines or substances or psychedelics. I think psychedelics probably a neutral term, but
yeah, I guess I call them medicines mostly. But I'm really open to whatever feels comfortable for people. Yeah.
Exactly, because sometimes it has a connotation of like medicine, or is it drug? Some people like to call it.
Right. Yeah.
So, definitely. I was thinking, let's say psychedelics, for example. Would you say that I have my personal understanding is that this breakthrough that everybody is looking for, like you said, it's good to maybe explore different ones. And I don't think so much it's to do with the substance itself or the psychedelic itself, but more about maybe the person as a container, because they are the container sort of immersing with the psychedelic. So I have this understanding that if they didn't get the breakthrough with psilocybin, yes, they can try another one, but not because the psilocybin is different or less than. It's just the way that it works differently at the time. Because some people categorize them. There is a notion, for example, 5-MeO-DMT is like God molecule.
Right. Yeah.
What are your
Yeah.
thoughts
I definitely don't want to slip into some kind of hierarchy of medicines being better than others, because that seems a little silly. And also, that's just not how it works. I think it's just the different medicines perform differently. They have different functions. They're going to different people are going to respond to them in different ways. And so I don't think we can say that one is better than the other. I do think we can differentiate them by saying that they seem to have different effects or work in different ways that I think are worth noticing those differences, because it may be relevant to what somebody needs at a particular moment. In the case of this particular example with mushrooms and this client, this is just my hunch. I don't know for sure, but I have seen this more than once where, because mushrooms are taken orally, again, this is just my pet theory. I don't know if this is true, but I suspect that if some people have a slower digestive kind of process, and then perhaps a quicker neurological metabolism of the medicine in their brain. It could be that even if they take a very high dose of mushrooms, it's quite hard for there to be kind of like a really high like peak of the medicine at any given time, because it's just not getting into the bloodstream fast enough and it's being metabolized a little too fast. And I'm saying this because for this client, and I've seen other people have this as well, it seems like no matter how many grams they take, they just can't quite get to that breakthrough point. And 5-MeO-DMT in that case is just very effective. Not that it's better, but it just, because it's so fast acting and you're taking it in a vaporized format. So you're bypassing the gut, and it's going into the bloodstream much faster. And it's just much more powerful in that way. And so sometimes it can be that sort of explosive charge, I think, that people need to break through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's the same for everyone? It delivers the same effect for everyone? For example, can it be that, there is a saying that it could be a full out of body, not, you're completely out of control, and it's an out of body experience. Do you think that's same for everyone, or can it be like a gradual process? I don't know, maybe a gradual progress. Is there such a thing with the 5-MeO-DMT?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I try never to make any assumptions about how a medicine will impact anybody. There are patterns, and it's helpful to notice those patterns. I know when I first started doing this work years ago, I made the error many times of speaking about these medicines in the second person. So I would say, well, you're going to feel this, and you're going to feel that, and you're going to, and I realized it's such a fallacy, because of course there is no one you, everybody is different. And I've learned actually to just use the first person pronoun and to say, well, I experience X, Y, and Z. And then I can say, well, some of my clients have experienced X, Y, and Z, but I'm never going to tell somebody what their experience is going to be, because I just don't know. And they don't know either. And it's just good to keep an open mind about that. Now, in terms of a progressive, slow process, absolutely, with 5-MeO-DMT, there is a way to do that. And I'm actually a huge advocate of that method. 5-MeO-DMT, in a way, has been pigeonholed, I think, as this kind of nuclear bomb of the psychedelic world. And I think that's just how it kind of came up in the culture, with this guy, Ken Nelson, who published this whole pamphlet about smoking the toad. And the pamphlet really emphasized this singular, massive dose kind of explosive ego death experience. And it'll do that for sure. And from a trauma-informed standpoint, an ethical standpoint, I don't think that's the best way to serve people initially. There are many guides out there who their goal is just to find that right dose, just to immediately put somebody in a full release the very first time they do it. And that's how I receive the medicine. I don't think it's the best way to do it. I think it's very dangerous, actually, psychologically, because I think it can really shatter people. And like I said, I've had people come into my practice from other guides who need to be put back together because they're just really scattered and disoriented. So I'm a big fan, I should say, of what's generally called in the underground the stepwise method. And it was developed by these two guys in the Bay Area. I'll leave their names anonymous, but I had the privilege of training with them directly, which was wonderful. And they started to work with vape pens instead of with pipes. And they use these kind of this progressive protocol where the concentration of the vape cartridges is going up. So it's usually called 1 to 8, 1 to 4, 1 to 2, and those numbers are just the mixing ratios of the medicine and the liquid carrier. And so yeah, you can start somebody. This is what I usually do for a person's first time with 5-MeO. I'll start them off on that 1 to 8 cartridge, and I even titrate the dose finer by using different counts of the inhalation. So I'll start somebody off with, okay, let's do 4 seconds on the 1 to 8 pen. For most people, that's a very gentle way to dip into the medicine. And then we kind of go up from there. We could go up to 6 seconds. And then if they're ready, we can go up to the 1 to 8 and so forth. And so, yeah, it really allows this gentle spectrum going into the medicine. And you can still have that full release, but you get to actually choose whether you're going to do it or not, because at some point you can stop if you start to feel overwhelmed. And that's what I love about it. It's so trauma informed. And people do stop. And I think I totally support that. I've had a number of clients, they get close, they can feel it, because you can feel that it's starting to, your sense of yourself, your body, it's starting to unravel. It's almost like you're about to get pushed off a cliff or something like that. And when people feel all the fear response that comes up, sometimes it feels overwhelming, and they say, I'm just not ready. And I don't push people. In fact, I validate them, and I say, if you don't feel called, like, absolutely, we can just stop. And people really appreciate that, because then there's not sort of this peer pressure, this sort of this sort of psychedelic hero story that you need to break through, you need to go all the way. There's almost kind of like a masculine energy to that, and I prefer working in this kind of feminine, energetic way of just meeting people gently where they are, and they can always come back, or maybe not. Maybe that's all they needed, but maybe 6 months, a year, they've done their integration work, and then they're ready for that full release.
Amazing. And this is how we should be speaking to it. Thank you so much for being very honest about the journeys and the use of the 5-MeO DMT. So I don't normally talk about my own personal experiences on the show with a guest, but I don't know, I feel like I feel called to share something with you. On my first experience with the 5-MeO DMT, I literally went nowhere. I didn't go anywhere. There's nothing. Around the time, I was immersing I was immersing myself in different medicines. Around the time, it was very early days, just a decade ago, where, it was we have so much more education now and understanding, but at the time that I started, it was more of me desperately trying to find the right medicine. I was, again, similar to what I was sharing with you earlier. I thought it would be one experience and that's it. And I kept searching. And also my first experience with 5-MeO DMT, nothing happened. And this very quiet voice said, look, we love you coming back and coming back and coming back to the psychedelics, but your work isn't here. You need to go home. You need to go back home and start your work right there. So that was my first one. My second one, Mira, again, not going anywhere, very much in the room. However, I decided to close my eyes, and I went into an experience when I was 4 years old. And I had a glimpse of this experience around the age of 4, standing on top of stairs, very dark, around 4 a.m. Those were the numbers that coming. And then me looking into the dark, staircase. It seemed like a void. And that's it. So obviously I went back to speak to my mother, and she confirmed. So I had no idea about this memory. And so those kind of things, if you know what I mean. So that's why when people talk about this non-dualistic, dissolving, one with the God experience with 5-MeO, I'm thinking, well, that's definitely not my experience at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like a really powerful revelation, and revisiting of that memory. And I'm so glad that you shared that. I think it is so important just to validate everybody's experience for its own uniqueness, and to recognize that, yes, there are certain patterns with medicine, but everybody's experience may be different. And there is no one full release or one 5-MeO experience, and whatever is happening for you, that's what's important, is to connect with that. And that's beautiful. And
I agree. And that message changed my life. It was the biggest breakthrough. Usually we expect the breakthroughs to come from these dualistic experiences where you leave your body and dissolve and be one with the divine. No,
exactly.
Mine was literally sitting on that mattress with this tiny, quiet voice telling me, your work isn't here. That was the turning point.
That's beautiful. And, it actually, what you're sharing dovetails a lot with what I like to call unjourneying, which is this sort of arc that I feel happens or can happen in one's relationship with psychedelics. And to me, what you shared is perhaps an example of that. And what I mean by unjourneying is that it seems that when people start to work with these medicines, for the most part, there is a certain kind of journeying that seems to be very, very common. And I just mean by that, these experiences of going elsewhere, And maybe, even what you shared is a kind of part of it is a kind of journey, like going to a childhood memory. Sometimes you have these very dramatic journeys of, like you said, going into unity consciousness and whatnot. But at least for me, and this isn't everyone's path, and I don't mean to imply that there's only one way to do this because there are so many, but I feel like with continued psychedelic work, it feels like those journeys increasingly feel in a way extraneous somehow, or unnecessary, or just sort of like a distraction from just what's happening right now, right here in our senses, in our body, in the room, just getting in touch with the dance of sensation as it's unfolding. And I had kind of an interesting, actually, I'm drawing a parallel between what you shared with your journey, or whatever term we want to use for that, your experience with a voice, because the first time I stumbled upon this Unjourneying, I was taking some mushrooms, and I very much had this desire to escape into the fractal wonderland. I, had some music on. But something very strange was happening to me neurologically, because I had taken some lion's mane earlier, maybe about a year ago or prior to that experience. And I had this very dramatic neuroinflammatory kind of almost like allergic reaction to the lion's mane, which may be related to some of my underlying neurological health problems. But the point of me sharing that is that the lion's mane was doing something to my brain that made it quite inflamed, and actually made it hard for some reason. It created like a blockage energetically to going elsewhere. So I took the mushrooms expecting to, go into some experience, and instead it just sort of kicked me right out. And there I was, just sitting up in bed, just looking out the window, and it was raining. And I was just there. I was just there in my body and my senses. And some kind of light bulb went on, and I thought, interesting. Maybe in a way I've been spiritually bypassing. I've been attached to the light show, the experience of psychedelics, when in fact, the longer arc of this work for me may just be a kind of increased mindfulness and presence and just being here. And so I hope I'm not drawing too loose of a parallel, but I see a connection between what you're sharing with that experience, with the message of, do the work. Like you don't need to go into
anywhere.
This kind of,
anywhere.
You don't need to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole thing with Unjourneying. It's like you feel like you go somewhere initially, maybe sometimes, but eventually I think you just end up, it all just kind of converges into right here. And that's one of the interesting things about this Unjourneying in my experience, is when you have that perspective and that intention to just be here, then when you take medicines, at least this is what I find, less and less happens. And I found this very interesting with 5-MeO, DMT in particular. Well, I've had this happen with all the medicines that I work with now, is that even if I take a pretty high dose, I mean, if I'm working, let's say, with the 1 to 4 pen, 10-second inhale, which for some people might be a full release kind of dose, there's nothing much that really happens. I'm just sort of sitting there, and it's just a reminder of, this is it, just right here, nowhere to go. Just this is what's happening. And I don't know, to me, that's a much more authentic, heart-centered, just connected integration of actually just being with our direct experience, as opposed to wanting some kind of overlay of something spiritual or beatific or grandiose or transcendent. It's very immanent. It's just about this moment. Yeah. Like we're just talking right now, right? Like here we are.
I love this. It's probably why I shared my experience. Like I said, I don't tend to share my own personal experiences in these shows. Maybe I should. This is exactly why it's so synchronistic, because your name of your business is Unjourneying, right? So your coaching, your facilitation offering, Unjourneying. I think that's so relevant and related to everything I've been thinking lately, especially as of late. And I've been thinking not long ago, I was thinking that maybe in the beginning, when we discover psychedelics, it's all about go, go, go. Like, what can I do next? What can I try next? In the beginning of my podcast series, I used to call that the habit of psychedelic shopper. We all
What's
become
the word?
psychedelic shopper, like psychedelic shopper.
Oh, a shopper. Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
We want to try ayahuasca. We want to try this and that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we want to just collect all these experiences in our,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then we want to continually take them. And so when I had that little tiny voice telling me that, I realized that's why it was the turning point. It's a bit like the teachings of Zen,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism, right? Before enlightenment, chalk would carry water,
Yes,
right? And
absolutely.
then
Yeah, it
after,
kind of comes full circle. Yeah.
absolutely. I feel like that's why, I mean, for our listeners as well, and if they are in the beginning of their journey, of course, there's going to be this desire to try this, try that, try every weekend, which we see them, right? We see that people
Mm-hmm.
are taking medicines every weekend, not integrating, because there
Mm-hmm.
is although we want to say that they don't create addiction, but humans, we can have tendencies to be addicted to something. Not that these substances are addictive, but we can have a personality or a patterns that are addictive. So I've heard of people taking ayahuasca every weekend for like a couple of years, and that
Mm.
what blows my mind.
Yeah,
And I
that's a
know
lot of
about,
medicine.
right, and I
Mm-hmm.
know about retreat centers where they do 3, 4 different medicines in one sort of over 5 days, like Cambos, Bufos, you know, mushrooms,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ayahuasca,
Right,
mescaline,
right.
right? So that kind of thing. And I'm guess, I guess it's a journey in the beginning. Like you said, you go and you do these things, you want to accumulate so many different experiences. And then as we mature, as we start integrating, I call that the growing up process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We come back full circle. Now it is, for me, it's so much more incentivized when I'm not going anywhere. Like there's so much incentive in being here and learning to navigate the mundane.
Yes, yes.
That's the spiritual practice for me.
Mm.
Having
Beautiful.
peace
Yeah.
here, here in the moment, in the body, in the mind, in the, like you said, direct experience of me is for me is more precious now than how I used to chase the spiritual out
Mm-hmm.
of body
Mm-hmm.
experiences before.
Yeah, no, that's so beautifully said. It really resonates with me. And yeah, it's so important to say that because psychedelics are having a moment right now. And I
Mhm.
think this is one of the big psychological traps. And I would say it falls under that heading of spiritual bypassing.
Right.
And I know a lot of folks in the community who I see these patterns. In a way, I want to say, especially with 5-MeO DMT, because that full release experience is, even though it may not be, like you said, addictive in a kind of neurobiological way, the way an opiate or alcohol may be, there's a certain function it's serving the person's life to avoid. I even once had a guide come into my practice to do psychotherapy, and he acknowledged to me, he said, I realize that every time I feel like I'm having some trouble in my life, because I have access to the medicine, I just go and I just talk to God. And I don't, it's like, oh, I have to do my taxes. Well, I could do my taxes or I could go talk to God, and he was acknowledging and noticing this pattern of, oh, I'm not actually meeting my life as it is. I'm not actually, showing up with my body, with the feelings of, annoyance or frustration or whatever as energy in the body, because, I'm just escaping. So it can become a tool of escape.
Yeah.
And it's very enchanting that way. I think, to get sucked into that, and I think it's hard not to, in a way. I mean, I think for me, I spent a lot of time in that kind of chasing, and something has to happen at some point, I think, to stop the chasing. Maybe you get a message like you did, or maybe like me, something strange happens to your brain that just alters, or maybe you just get you get burned out somehow, and you realize that you're just craving elsewhere, instead of just settling into what's actually happening now.
Yeah.
Even if you are feeling anxious, it's like, okay, you're feeling anxious, so what's that like? What do you feel in your body? Okay, you're feeling sad. Is it heavy? Is it colored blue? Is it How big is it? These are the sort of things that we get into when we're actually showing up for our experience as a
Yeah.
texture. Yeah.
Yeah. This is so beautiful. And these are the grounding conversations I love. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is the capacity. You come from a trauma-informed background. This is sort of like my playground. I love that. And I always feel like there's a reason why we chase and bypass. There's a reason. There's this like
Yes.
deep compassion in my heart because I did that in the beginning when I discovered medicines. I did that. I became a psychedelic shopper. But then I'm thinking, because maybe that's the conversation we need to have. Currently I try and bring a lot of conversation around building capacity, nervous system capacity. It's almost like growing a new spine to hold the challenges, hold this uncomfortable feelings, hold everything that the life is throwing curveballs all the time. And, as young children, you shared generously, and thank you for your childhood experiences. We all come from families sadly not so functional and present and self-aware, and therefore as kids I think we learn to escape very quickly.
Yes.
And we miss the chance to build that capacity and the strong spine, which is metaphorically strong center. Therefore, we don't know how to, instead of having that difficult conversation in our homes, we want to go and have a conversation with Mother Ayahuasca. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It's
100%. 100%. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. And I love that you're bringing in the compassionate lens to this, because that can be another kind of trap, a kind of projection, right? Within the psychedelic space, I could point at other people and be like, oh, that person's spiritually bypassing, or that person's, and that's another kind of judgment and division. It's like you said, let's ask the question, why are we bypassing? We're bypassing because we're hurt, we're scared. And even, we have to be careful about how we language this. I know in psychology, a lot of times they talk about avoidance as kind of the term of art, right? For not feeling your feelings. And that can have perhaps a shade, not necessarily, but it can have the shade of judgment, like the person is not being, mature or something like that, or they're not very evolved, because they're avoiding. And we might perhaps use the word like it's a protection, is it a bypass, or is it a protection because the person feels like deeply vulnerable and scared? And actually, a lot of times, things that we describe psychologically as symptoms, you could also reframe as really ingenious solutions that the nervous system developed, solutions that are simply past their expiration date, right? So it's like, if as a child you had a lot of violence and strife and abuse in your home, and your nervous system learned that you could just go off into some kind of fantasy land and not feel that, and that's what allowed you psychologically to get through your childhood, so that you wouldn't end up in some kind of, on the schizophrenia spectrum with your mind really divided against itself. That's amazing. I mean, that's an amazing skill, right, that the nervous system learned. And I think what happens is, we take all these skills that allowed us to survive. It's almost like, I think of it as like a suit of armor that we fashioned for ourselves, that we put on, that allowed us to get through all the scuffles and scrapes and battles of our childhood. But then, of course, at some point, maybe in our teens, our 20s, or much later in our lives, like we realize we're walking around with this huge, heavy suit of armor that's very painful. It's very constricting, and it keeps us from being open-hearted and connecting with others. And so we have to learn how to take off the suit of armor, but that has to be done very carefully, part by part, piece by piece, because, if you think again about 5-MeO, if that suit of armor just comes blown off, that can be very destabilizing, very, very, very frightening. And so, yeah, I think it's a very sensitive, tender process that has to be approached with a lot of understanding, a lot of compassion. And yeah, we can't heal people through judgments, right? Like, oh, you're bypassing, you need to, it's like, let's heal the wounds and the fear, and get in touch with the fear that is motivating the escape. And then once you do that, you've already sort of broken the cycle of bypassing, right? Because the second you actually feel the fear, you actually feel the sadness, there is no bypass in that moment. You actually are right there with the feeling. And that's the start of putting a wrench kind of in that process. So you're learning a new conditioned response of just being here.
Yes, absolutely. Just like you said, you're learning a new skill. It's almost like, sometimes I think in society, some of the judgments come from, we meet people who are so educated and they seem to be very intellectual. And it's hard to put the two together. Like you're looking at this person done so much in their lives and they look all put together and they're very intelligent. And then suddenly when they take the medicines, they go into this tiny scared, fearful state. And you can't just put the two together and you think, why is this person acting this way? I mean, a lot of the trauma-informed approach that, I'm passionate about, especially in the psychedelic facilitation or the spaces, one of the things that sometimes it could be a simple conversation to have with this person, just because they have titles on big shoes, or they've done so much in their lives. When it comes to a very young part that is fearful and scared and rejected, or it fragmented, and these parts suddenly they start to feel it. They go into they constrict into this tiny little toddlery states. I think that's where the work is. I think we assume that just because somebody is so capable and they achieve so much in their lives, we think, are they acting out, or what is this? Like, why are they behaving this way? And yet, that's exactly where they need to be, right? So I think, and having this conversation with them, in the beginning, they might say, "What are you talking about? I don't feel like I'm touching a young part or fragmented or whatever it is." But yeah, these are the hard, difficult conversations that facilitators need to have, I guess. So I don't know how you deal with that and what you see as a theme.
Yeah, I love how you shared that. I often feel like we're all just traumatized children going around pretending to be adults. Like you scratch the surface and, we all have our inner child wounds. I know I certainly do. And it's a lifelong healing process. I don't really believe in some kind of idealized enlightenment where somebody has, transcended all of their childhood conditioning. I mean, to me, that's another, even just believing in that idea is another kind of bypass. I think the work is meeting our humanity as it is, and we all have these wounds. And yeah, I have really in-depth conversations with people about their childhood trauma. That's an essential part of my process. And as a psychotherapist, the very beginning of the work, after I do the initial consultation with people, is I have them fill out a pretty extensive questionnaire that really goes into depth about their childhood and about their traumas. And if they don't feel comfortable sharing on the form, we can just do it all in session. But the first session, or the first official session that I meet with them after they fill out their intake paperwork is, we're having these really deep dives around, what were some of the early childhood experiences, even sometimes pre-verbal experiences that they've pieced together from talking with their parents or talking with siblings, that really, kind of locked in place a certain attachment style, a certain kind of protective pattern. And the reason for me that's such valuable information is because absolutely, like, that will come up, especially with deep doses. And I'll say, especially with the rectal administration of the 5-MeO-DMT, for whatever reason, I don't know what again, these are just my pet theories. I can't prove this, but it, I think there's something going on there with the root chakra, with the lower vagus nerve. I know when I was a child, all of the trauma for me, all of the corporal punishment, it really impacted like my pelvic floor in particular. So I had all these potty training issues when I was a child. I used to like, soil myself like at school, like fairly old, like when I was in like first and second grade, I'd be having these accidents at school. It's very unusual kind of behavior. What was going on there, and I think it was a lot of the way that the trauma had been put into my body and put into that particular part of my body by the place where this violence was delivered onto my body. And it wasn't until I received the rectal 5-MeO-DMT that I felt those bundles of trauma, however you want to describe it, whether that's, talking about it as a, trauma stored in the body, in the pelvic floor, whether you want to bring in the chakra system and talk about the root chakra kind of opening. But I felt this profound kind of opening and releasing. And it was deeply transformative. And I see this a lot with people with the medicine delivered that particular way. It seems like our really old wounds sometimes get kind of calcified in a way, like in in tension, like physical tension in the body. And a lot of people are very tight in their pelvis in particular, and that's why a lot of people have GI issues or sexual blockages or pelvic floor dysfunction. A lot of this is trauma. And yeah, that medicine, for whatever reason, like the rectal, it takes people back to those early childhood preverbal traumas. And it really, from the inside out, it's working those energetic contractions out. And it's people really do go back to childhood a lot. I see all sorts of behavior, like people, sucking their thumbs, or acting very much like infants, like assuming fetal positions and things like this. So they're going back to those vulnerable moments and reprogramming what happened there.
Wow, it makes sense. I mean, the root energy center, it's our rooting, it's our grounding, it's our connection to the earth, it's connection to the the world, the real world. Yes. Yeah. It's everything. So it just makes sense, Mira. So really appreciate you sharing that. If our listeners are interested in that, they can always get in touch with you, of course. I'm just kind of looking at our time, and I know we kind of end of our conversation.
Yeah.
We will need to have you back again soon, because we haven't covered a lot of the
things. We didn't talk about salvia.
Exactly. We can maybe touch on it a little bit now, and then
I don't have anything right after this, so
great.
I'm free.
Sure.
Whatever works for you. Yeah.
Let's touch on the salvia divinorum, because it's a medicine or psychedelic medicine substance that I've been interested in, and I haven't really met anyone who works with it yet. So it'd be nice to just hear your take on what is it, if you can tell our listeners. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to tell you about salvia. It's a very, very interesting medicine. It's completely different from most psychedelics. And the reason is at a neurological level. So most psychedelics that people are familiar with, I would say, usually the tryptamines, and these are things like your mushrooms, ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT, but even some other medicines, the phenethylamines and LSD, the ergotamines and stuff like that. They mostly work on a similar set of receptors, which is usually this 5-HT2A, 5-HT1A. These are the serotonin receptors. Primarily, that's what's happening. Ketamine is another different one because that's hitting your NMDA receptors, but most of the time that's where the activity is happening in those serotonin receptors. But salvia it's the only psychedelic that works on the kappa opioid receptor. So there's no other medicine I'm aware of out there, especially one that's naturally occurring, that targets that receptor. And I always like to explain to people, kappa opioid is distinct from the mu opioids. These are not opiates. Sometimes people hear opioid and they have certain ideas of what that means, but this is not like an opiate drug. This is a different class of opiate receptors, or opioid receptors. But so I want to say a little bit briefly about the history, because salvia has gotten a bit of a bad reputation, especially in the United States. I'm not sure if that's carried over much, where you are in the UK or elsewhere. But what happened was, salvia, it grows naturally in this one particular part of Mexico, in Oaxaca, and this is the same region that's known for psilocybin mushrooms, and the Mazatec, which this indigenous people who are well known for Maria Sabina, and that kind of lineage of the transmission of mushroom knowledge and mushroom wisdom and healing. A lot of people don't know that the same people, the Mazatec, they also worked with and work with salvia divinorum. So that's kind of the main other plant, sort of psychoactive plant medicine that they worked with. And so it has this long-standing indigenous healing tradition in Oaxaca. And unfortunately, what happened was sometime, it seems like around the 2000s, I don't know exactly why, but salvia extracts started getting sold in smoke shops in the United States. And it was not a controlled substance in any way whatsoever back then. And so a lot of people just, saw it in smoke shops and they thought, oh, this looks interesting, I'll just try it, not really having any idea what it was. And so I've talked to so many people who will tell me, oh yeah, salvia, I tried that once when I was, 15, and it was terrible. It was so dysphoric. And that's because they weren't doing it with a healing intention. They didn't know any better, right? Or they just wanted to get messed up in some way or trip. So yeah, so there's a lot of sort of negative stories around salvia. There's also been some viral videos. Miley Cyrus has this viral video for doing salvia. And so there's been in the United States this kind of, moral backlash against salvia. And it's accrued this reputation as something that is very dysphoric and, doesn't have any healing potential. So that's unfortunate. I'm happy to talk about it because I'm trying to rehabilitate the reputation of salvia and let people know that it's been misused, but it has this ancient healing tradition. So let's talk about, what it is and how you take it and what it might feel like. So it's it's a plant. It's traditionally the Mazatec, how they take it is it's called quitting. So they actually take the leaves and kind of roll them up and then put them in their mouths and chew on the leaves, and it releases the psychoactive ingredient, which is called salvinorin A. And it's actually absorbed. The term is buccally. It's kind of a weird word. It's buccal, buccal. It's through the mucous membranes, like in the mouth, and so it's absorbed that way. And so that's one way to do it. And if you do it that way, it tends to be a kind of slower, gentler come up. I mean, you can get into some pretty deep material, but it's very slow the way it's absorbed that way. Now, the way that I work with it, that I found to be the most effective, that I found to be the most accessible for people, is I do offer it buccally. However, I don't use the chewing of the leaves because that just gets a bit cumbersome for people. It's just like, it's like a big mouthful of leaves, and it's just kind of unpleasant and hard to work with. And so I have this colleague who is just a brilliant salvia expert, and he prepares this. It's a powder that it's a full spectrum extraction from the leaves, but then he combines it with cornstarch, and so it forms this nice light green powder. It looks very much like matcha powder and green tea powder. And you put that in your mouth, and you can measure it down to the milligram, so you can really titrate the dose really precisely. And you just hold that in your mouth, and it's quite easy to do. It sort of feels like melted chocolate or something like that. It's not unpleasant at all. And you hold it in your mouth for about 20, 30 minutes. And then you have an equivalent experience to that quitting that the Mazatec have, except perhaps you can go even deeper because you can get kind of more material in your mouth that way. It's more concentrated. And so you're dosing it somewhere between, maybe like 200 milligrams up to maybe, 2 grams of that powder and beyond. And in terms of the effects, salvia, it's I do want to be clear, it's not inherently dysphoric like people are afraid of. And I will say, just as a word of warning, there is something about it that is a bit slippery and a bit disorienting. And so I do often say to people, I think it's probably one of the last psychedelics that you should try. Like in my system, when I work with people, I usually start people off with 5-MeO-DMT. And then once they're very familiar with that space, then we kind of move on to working with N-DMT. And once they've got those two under their belt, then I tell them, okay, maybe we're ready to try salvia. Just because it's so, when we're talking about journeying and unjourneying, its potential to make you travel, to propel you into, alien worlds, to other universes, to make the very fabric of reality feel like it's just, kind of unzipping and revealing a completely new world that you didn't even know existed. It's very strong. It really has that potential to really take you to these very mystical elsewheres. And so I do think it's, best to approach it with caution and to start low and go slow. And I think that the reason I recommend having the other medicines under your belt is because once, at least the way that I work with people, you've kind of gotten used to this mode of unjourneying where you're used to kind of meditating actively on the medicine. So instead of it sweeping you elsewhere, you have this capacity to just sit and hold your mind very wide open, allowing the waves of energy just to come through. Once you have that, and getting to what you said about the rooting, maybe your root chakra perhaps is very like energetically strong, your center is very strong. Then I think it's easier to experiment with salvia and not have it just sweep you downstream like so quickly. And you can use it as another kind of meditation. So in some ways, salvia is analogous to 5-MeO-DMT in terms of the fact that like at lower doses, you can do this work with it that feels very somatic. There's this way that it has this kind of like pulsing quality to it. It feels like it finds areas in your system that are kind of contracted and it's kind of working them out. As it gets deeper, it definitely gets much more deconstructed. It feels like it's very much like deconstructs the very fabric of reality. And this gets into some of the non-dual, you could say, phenomenology, or maybe a little bit of philosophy, where it's this, if the subjective experience of the universe is something that your mind is creating, that's a kind of dream, you could say, that your mind is creating, or a sort of representation and consciousness. It feels like salvia modulates that in such a way that it makes it very clear that time and space and all of your memories and all of your thoughts, that all of them, even though everything might feel very kind of solid, and as it appears, like it can almost feel like the entire sensorium, your entire universe is, time is maybe like slowing down, or maybe space is kind of getting crumpled or becoming like syrupy or vibrating. It's quite interesting. I mean, it's quite interesting to just experience like a moment of consciousness, or maybe you're having, I don't know, thoughts about, I don't know, my mom, or like the recent US election, or all these things that feel quite solid. And then you're seeing all of those things almost melting, and becoming this one kind of almost like a fabric. It feels very tactile. And so this is a very interesting realization. Wow, like everything that I'm experiencing right now is, you could say, energy. It's all consciousness, at least subjectively. And it's quite instructive in that way. It's very interesting. So that's kind of the buckle route. I'll touch on the vaporization route, which is actually my favorite way to take it personally. And again, I have to credit my colleague. I wish I could say his name, but he needs to remain anonymous for his protection. But he developed this just ingenious, brilliant way to take this medicine that's just so beautiful. And so the other way that people take it is they smoke it. This is very popular in the United States. Now, I really do not recommend smoking it for so many reasons. It's very unpleasant. It's very hard on the lungs. I have very sensitive lungs. It's really hard to know how much salvinorin you're actually getting in any given dose. And so it's easy to overdose yourself. When I say overdose, I don't mean like, it's going to be dangerous physiologically, but it just might be overwhelming. But basically what he's done is he takes the pure white extracted salvinorin A molecule. He's like a master extractor. So I get this like fine powder from him. Now what you do is you measure out a certain amount of it into acetone, which is a solvent that just completely dissolves it. So you just have a clear liquid. And then what you do is there's this device called I don't want to get too technical here, but it's called a box mod, and it has this thing called an RDA on it. It's just a vaporization device, basically, with a battery or a little computer in it. And it has this metal mesh, and you put just drops of the solution on this mesh, and they're very finely dosed. So each drop you can tune it how you want to. I usually do either like 125 or 250 micrograms. The acetone evaporates, so there's no trace. This is very pure laboratory grade acetone. So there's no trace of that left. And so all you have is just a little tiny drop of a little crust of white salvinorin, just the pure molecule. And believe it or not, if you actually look into the few human subjects studies that they've done at a university research level with salvia, this is more or less how they do it. They dissolve it in acetone, they evaporate it in like a beaker, and they hit the beaker with a butane torch. So they're using that method of vaporizing it. But in a way, that's actually cruder because the butane torch is very, very hot. It's kind of roasting the medicine. But with this box mod, this RDA, you can program it. So when you hit the fire button, it's delivering just the right amount of current, just the right amount of temperature to just vaporize it in this very gentle way. And so you can inhale it that way. And it's very light and it feels very gentle in the lungs. And you're dealing with similar phenomenology, I would say. Very low doses, again, it can get very physical. You can feel this sense of kind of a non-dual merger with everything, but instead of it being very like flashy and ethereal, like 5-MeO, where it feels like everything just gets super light, almost just like space or like air. There's something about salvia that, to me at least, it feels very tactile. Like it feels like, like all of reality is just this kind of fabric or almost like clay, and you can just feel that it's kind of one thing. So it's similar phenomenology, but the speed is just hyper fast. So it's especially the higher doses, there's almost no come up that you can feel. Like it's just I'll take it and I'll sit there for 2 seconds, and there's this feeling of I don't know if anything's happened yet. And then all of a sudden you're like just deep in the experience, and it might feel like time. It's almost like somebody has a remote control on the movie that is your consciousness, and they're putting doing one frame at a time. So it's just like everything might be going in slow motion. There's this feeling of perhaps a loss of control. There's I think a deep deconstruction of the sense of will, the sense that I'm in control of my thoughts or my body. There's this feeling that thoughts are just coming out of nowhere. My body sensations are coming out of nowhere. And then I find very instructive too, spiritually, because how much of our suffering is predicated on the fact that we have these dilemmas, should I do this? Should I do that? What should I do with my life? And, salvia, at least for me, it seems to usher in this realization of, wow, like I don't even know if I have control of anything. Like I can see that each thought appears, spontaneously. Where did that come from? I don't know. Who created that thought? Okay, my hand is now moving to my head because I'm itching, this thing on my head or whatever. And, how did my hand move? It just moved to my head. And now I'm feeling the sensations of the scratching on my head. I mean, it's all just happening. So there's something very spontaneous about the arising of consciousness about experience. And that actually feels incredibly liberating and quite fascinating. So I'm going to pause there because I've just said a lot, but that's salvia for me in a nutshell. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. Thank you for explaining. This was wonderful. Yes, I will definitely would like to have another session just to maybe go into the effects and mechanisms of action and some people, what are they experiencing and what kind of healing proposition is there, things like that. But for now, maybe that we can close and we'll bring our listeners back to your mission. What's the mission and your offerings? And what can you share with us, and how can they connect with you? Where can they find you? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for bringing it back. I love how you frame this, because you start with, why do I do this work? And now we're kind of, in a way, returning to it. So it's like I went through my own suffering, trying to heal myself. And then now, not that my own work is done, it will continue indefinitely, I'm sure. But I feel like I've gotten to a place in my life where I feel I'm resourced enough to now serve others and to resource other people. And so that is my mission, is to help people heal and to help people wake up, whatever that means for them. I don't want to impose my own story on what their healing should be or what their awakening or spiritual insight should be. I'm here to help, kind of facilitate that process. And yeah, the mission, what the work looks like is integration sessions, usually over Zoom. And then we're planning a retreat that could be a half day, a full day. It could be a multi-day. I'm very flexible. I love to collaborate with people to design these very customized experiences for them to meet their needs. And yeah, if you want to work with me, the easiest way is just to go to my website. So it's Unjourneying.com, and you'll see there's a link to request a session with me, an initial consultation. And that'll bring up a form, and it'll ask you different questions about yourself, so I can learn about you and make sure we're going to be a good match. And then we can meet and kind of go from there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mira. I truly appreciate what you're doing in your work and everything that you stand for. I feel that now that we're kind of moving along, growing up in this sort of educational part of the or the space in the psychedelic work, I feel like we're going to need a lot of people who are grounded and coming from trauma informed, and also being really responsible when they're offering these medicines to people that are interested. So thank you for doing this work.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you so much for just your generous questions and also sharing your personal experience. I just thought that was really meaningful, and I love that we have these points of connection in terms of how we approach this work. So thank you so much.
Likewise. I know we'll be having you back very soon.
Yeah,
so,
I can't wait.
All the best, and yes, we'll be following your work. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed this session. And as always, drop a comment, ask a question, and get in touch with myself or Mira anytime. Don't be shy. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now. Thanks, Mira. See you very soon. Bye now.
See you soon. Bye bye.